The Miller family was the pride of Crestview Lane. To any outsider, they represented the pinnacle of the suburban dream. Arthur Miller was a successful architect with an eye for structural perfection, while his wife, Evelyn, was a renowned landscape designer whose gardens looked like scenes stolen from a Renaissance painting. Their two children, Leo and Mia, were straight-A students, polite, and possessed a natural charm that made them favorites in the neighborhood. Their home, a sprawling Victorian estate painted in cream and gold, stood as a monument to their collective success. In a world of chaos, the Millers were an island of order. But on the morning of October 14th, the order collapsed. It wasn't a loud crash or a violent disturbance that signaled the end. Instead, it was the silence, a thick, unnatural silence that seemed to swallow the morning bird calls. The first person to notice was Mrs. Gable, the elderly neighbor who lived across the street. Every morning at precisely 7:15 a.m., Arthur Miller would walk to the end of the driveway to retrieve the newspaper, always offering a crisp nod to Mrs. Gable as she watered her hydrangeas. At 7:45 a.m., Evelyn would drive the kids to school in her polished SUV. But today, the newspaper lay unclaimed on the damp pavement. The SUV sat idle in the driveway, its windows fogged by the morning mist. By noon, the silence had become heavy. Mrs. Gable, driven by a mixture of curiosity and a growing sense of dread, walked across the street. She knocked on the heavy oak door. No answer. She tried the handle, expecting it to be locked. But it turned with a smooth, oiled click. The door swung open to reveal a house that looked exactly as it should, and yet felt entirely wrong. The breakfast table was set. 4 bowls of oatmeal sat in their respective places. Steam no longer rose from them. The surface of the porridge had hardened into a cold, rubbery skin. A half-peeled orange lay next to Leo's plate, the rind curling slightly. A glass of orange juice stood untouched, a thin film forming at the top. The coffee pot in the kitchen was still on, the burnt scent of overcooked beans hanging bitter in the air. Everything was in its place. Arthur's briefcase was by the door. The children's backpacks were lined up in the hallway, packed and ready for the school day. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned chairs, no broken glass, no blood. It was as if the family had simply evaporated into the air mid-sentence. When the police arrived an hour later, led by Detective Silas Thorne, the scene baffled them. Thorne was a man who believed in footprints, fingerprints, and logic. But the Miller house offered him none of these. As he moved through the rooms, he felt a chilling sensation. The beds were made, the clothes were neatly folded in the closets. And the family dog, a golden retriever named Barnaby, was found sleeping soundly in the basement, oblivious to the disappearance of his masters. Thorne stood in the center of the living room, staring at a framed family portrait on the mantel. The Millers smiled back at him, their eyes bright and full of life. "Where did you go?" he whispered to the empty air. He didn't know then that this was only the beginning of a riddle that would tear the town of Crestview apart. The perfect family had vanished, leaving behind a perfect house. But as Thorne looked closer at the portrait, he noticed something he hadn't seen before, a small, jagged scratch across Arthur Miller's throat in the photo. Detective Silas Thorne was not a man who believed in ghosts. But the Miller residence was starting to make him reconsider. The house was a masterpiece of stillness. As the forensics team dusted the breakfast table for prints, Thorne retreated to Arthur Miller's private study on the second floor. It was a room that smelled of expensive leather, old blueprints, and mahogany. On the surface, it was as orderly as the rest of the house. But Thorne had spent 20 years looking for the things people tried to hide in plain sight. He began by searching the desk. Every drawer was locked. But Thorne possessed a set of tools and a lack of patience for such obstacles. When the bottom drawer clicked open, he didn't find architectural plans or tax returns. Instead, he found a stack of burner phones and a series of bank statements from an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. The balance was staggering, nearly $7 million, transferred in small, incremental amounts over the last 3 years. This was not the income of a suburban architect. This was the hoard of a man living a double life. While Thorne investigated the finances, his partner, Officer Sarah Jenkins, was in the children's rooms. In Mia's room, everything was pink and pristine. But tucked inside a hollowed-out copy of The Great Gatsby was a diary. The last entry, dated the night before the disappearance, was chilling in its brevity. It didn't talk about school or friends. It simply said, "He's watching the windows again. Dad says it's just the shadows, but shadows don't have eyes that glow in the dark. We are leaving tomorrow. I hope we make it." The discovery sent a cold shiver through the investigation. Who was he? And where did the Millers think they were going without their luggage, their car, or even their shoes? Thorne returned to the kitchen, where the forensics lead, Miller's old friend Dr. Eris, was pointing at the floor with a high-intensity UV light. "Silas, look at this," Eris whispered. Under the purple glow, the pristine white tiles revealed a different story. There were faint, rhythmic smears leading from the dining table toward the cellar door. "It's not blood," Eris clarified, "it's a chemical compound. Highly concentrated sedative mixed with some kind of industrial cleaning agent. Someone didn't just take them. Someone cleaned the trail as they went. But they missed the microscopic splashes under the table." Suddenly, the perfect image of the Miller family began to shatter. A neighbor's doorbell camera, located 3 houses down, finally provided a crumb of evidence. At 3:14 a.m., a black delivery van with no markings or license plates had coasted down the street with its headlights off. It didn't stop in front of the Miller house. It stopped at the edge of the woods behind their property. Thorne took a flashlight and headed into the dense forest that bordered the backyard. The ground was soft from the autumn rain. About 50 yards into the trees, he found a discarded silk scarf, Evelyn's favorite, the one she was wearing in the portrait on the mantel. It was snagged on a thorn bush, fluttering like a white flag of surrender. Beside it were 2 sets of heavy boot prints and the smaller, frantic scuff marks of children's sneakers. As Thorne followed the tracks, they abruptly stopped at a clearing. There were no more footprints, no signs of a struggle. Just a circle of scorched earth where the grass had been, burned black in a perfect geometric ring. The air in the clearing felt ionized, vibrating with a low-frequency hum that made Thorne's teeth ache. He realized then that the Millers hadn't just run away from a debt or a scandal. They were being hunted by something that operated outside the boundaries of Crestview's reality. The perfect family had been a shield, a disguise for something much more dangerous. Just as Thorne went to radio for backup, his flashlight flickered and died. In the sudden darkness of the woods, he heard it, a soft, rhythmic clicking sound, like fingernails tapping on glass, coming from the canopy of trees above his head. The clicking sound above Detective Thorne's head intensified, a metallic scratching that resonated through the damp night air. He stood frozen, his hand hovering over his service weapon. But as quickly as the sound had started, it vanished into the rustling of the leaves. Thorne didn't wait to find out what was lurking in the heights. He retreated to the safety of the Millers' brightly lit kitchen, where the hum of forensic equipment felt grounded and real. Back at the station, the investigation took a dark turn. The burner phones Thorne had found in Arthur's desk were finally cracked by the tech department. They weren't filled with messages from mistresses or business rivals. Instead, they contained coordinates, logistics for high-security facilities across the globe. It turned out Arthur Miller wasn't just an architect for luxury homes. He was the primary designer for black sites, ultra-secretive underground bunkers used by a shadow organization known only as the Aegis Group. Thorne realized that Perfect Family was the ultimate deep-cover operation. Evelyn wasn't just a gardener. She was a former intelligence officer, specializing in botanical toxins, which explained the sedative found on the kitchen floor. The Millers weren't a family living a dream. They were a specialized cell of operatives who had tried to retire from a life of international espionage. They weren't kidnapped. Thorne muttered to Officer Jenkins as they pored over the files. They were harvested. A deeper dive into Evelyn's background revealed that she had stolen something from the Aegis Group before vanishing into suburban life 10 years ago. It was a prototype, a biological encryption key stored within the genetic code of a human carrier. Thorne's blood ran cold as he looked at the medical records of the children. Leo and Mia weren't just Arthur and Evelyn's kids. Their DNA had been altered before birth. They were the encryption keys. The perfect family was actually a high-stakes vault. The investigation moved to the basement of the house, a place the forensics team had initially cleared. Thorne, driven by a hunch, began tapping on the walls behind the wine cellar. He found it, a hollow echo behind a rack of vintage Bordeaux. A hidden keypad was embedded in the masonry. Using the birthday of the children, a common weakness even for spies, he gained entry. The wall slid back with a pneumatic hiss, revealing a high-tech monitoring station. Screens flickered to life, showing every corner of the house and the surrounding woods. Thorne watched the playback from the night of the disappearance. The footage was grainy but clear enough to tell a terrifying story. At 3 a.m., the Millers were in the kitchen. Not in pajamas, but in tactical gear. They weren't being ambushed. They were preparing for a siege. Arthur was loading a compact submachine gun while Evelyn checked the seals on a set of gas masks. The children stood by the door, faces pale but remarkably calm, holding small canisters of what looked like pressurized oxygen. Suddenly, the windows didn't break, they melted. A group of figures clad in shimmering, light-bending suits, the source of the clicking sound Thorne had heard, materialized in the kitchen. These were the Erasers, the elite recovery team of the Aegis Group. The Millers fought with a desperate, practiced ferocity. Evelyn deployed a cloud of neurotoxin, and Arthur opened fire. But the Erasers moved with a speed that defied human biology. The most disturbing part of the footage was the end. After the Millers were subdued with high-frequency acoustic weapons, one of the Erasers turned directly toward the hidden camera. He removed his mask, revealing a face that was a mirror image of Arthur Miller. The architect always builds a back door, the double whispered into the camera before smashing it. The screen went to static. Thorne stood in the dark, realizing that the man he thought was a victim might have been an imposter all along, or worse, a prototype. The trail didn't end in the woods. It led to a subterranean world Thorne wasn't prepared to enter. The discovery of Arthur's double sent the investigation into a tailspin. Detective Thorne knew that if he followed the standard police protocol, the file would be classified by morning and he would be forced into silence. He had only a few hours before the Aegis Group wiped the town of Crestview from their map. He took the coordinates he had recovered from the basement and realized they pointed to a decommissioned quarry just 12 miles outside of town, a place locals called the Devil's Throat. Thorne drove through the night, the headlights of his car cutting through a thick, unnatural fog. When he arrived at the quarry, he didn't find a hidden base or a military camp. He found a single, solitary phone booth standing in the center of the desolate, rocky wasteland. It was ringing. With a trembling hand, Thorne picked up the receiver. "Detective," a voice spoke. It wasn't the voice of the man from the video. It was Leo, the young boy. "You shouldn't have come here. You're part of the facade now." "Leo. Where are you? Where is your family?" Thorne demanded, his eyes scanning the dark horizon. "We aren't a family, detective," the boy's voice was hollow, devoid of the warmth Thorne had seen in the photos. "We were a sequence. Arthur and Evelyn were the guardians, but they failed the primary objective. They started to feel love. And love is a corruption of the data." As Leo spoke, the ground beneath the phone booth began to vibrate. The quarry was a massive elevator. Thorne watched in silent horror as the rocky floor began to descend into the earth. As he went down, the walls of the shaft revealed rows upon rows of glass cylinders. Inside each cylinder were Millers. Thousands of them. Identical versions of Arthur, Evelyn, Leo, and Mia. all suspended in a pale blue fluid, waiting to be activated. The truth was more terrifying than any kidnapping. The vanishing wasn't a crime. It was a recall. The Aegis Group hadn't just built bunkers. They were building the perfect society, a world of replaceable, perfect people who could be deployed into any neighborhood to maintain absolute control and gather intelligence. The Miller family in Crestview Lane had simply been version 4.2. When Evelyn and Arthur began planning a real escape, the company decided to reset the experiment. Thorne reached the bottom of the shaft. The elevator doors opened to a white, sterile laboratory. Standing there were the Millers, the ones from the house. They weren't in chains. They were standing perfectly still, their eyes vacant and glowing with a faint blue light. Their memories had been wiped, their humanity deleted. They are ready for the next assignment. A man in a white lab coat said, walking toward Thorne. It was the Arthur double from the video, the original architect. In 3 days, they will be moved to a new city. New names, new lives, same perfection. And you, detective? You have shown a remarkable talent for finding things that are meant to stay lost. We have a vacancy for a chief of security in our new Seattle cell. Thorne reached for his gun, but his limbs felt heavy, unresponsive. He looked down and saw a small red dot on his chest. The clicking sound returned, louder this time. The erasers were behind him. The next morning, Crestview Lane was back to normal. A moving truck stood in front of the cream and gold Victorian house. A new family was moving in, a husband, a wife, and 2 beautiful children. They looked slightly different from the Millers, but they had the same polite smiles and the same perfect aura. Across the street, Mrs. Gable was watering her hydrangeas. She saw a man in a suit walking down the driveway to retrieve the newspaper. He looked like Detective Silas Thorne. But his movements were a bit too precise, his nod a bit too crisp. He smiled at her, but his eyes remained cold, like glass. The perfect family hadn't vanished. They had just been updated. And the town of Crestview, like the rest of the world, was none the wiser to the shadows living next door. The cycle of perfection continued, one vanishing at a time. The Aegis Group believed they had successfully reset Detective Silas Thorne, just as they had done with the Millers. For months, the new Silas Thorne walked the streets of a different city, performing his duties with mechanical precision. But the architect had made one fatal error. He underestimated the power of human trauma. Deep within the subconscious of the original Silas, a fragment of the devil's throat quarry remained, a jagged memory of the blue glowing eyes of the children. It started as a glitch. During a routine patrol, Silas saw a young girl dropping a red ball. The way the ball bounced triggered a flash of Mia Miller's diary. He's watching the windows. Again. The mental firewall. Inside Silas's brain flickered. A surge of raw, human emotion, grief, tore through the synthetic dampeners. For the first time since his update, Silas felt a sharp, stinging pain in his chest. He wasn't just a unit. He was a man remembered. Silas began to realize that if he was glitching, the Millers might be too. He used his high-level security clearance to track the Crestview cell. They had been relocated to a high-security compound in the Swiss Alps, hidden beneath a luxury ski resort. They were no longer a family. They were being used as alpha templates to stabilize the next generation of Aegis clones. Silas went rogue. He didn't use guns. He used the very system that created him. He leaked the Aegis Group's global coordinates to every major news outlet and intelligence agency in the world. But he knew that erasers would intercept the data before it could be published. He needed a physical override. He arrived at the Alps facility during a heavy blizzard. The facility was a marvel of glass and white steel, humming with the same low-frequency vibration he had felt in the woods. As he breached the inner sanctum, he was met by the architect. "You are a failed experiment, Silas," the architect said, holding a remote detonator. "I can terminate your pulse with a single click." "Then do it," Silas whispered, stepping closer. But you forgot one thing about architects. They don't just build back doors into houses. They build them into their hearts. Silas wasn't there to kill the architect. He was there to upload a virus, not a digital one, but a sensory memory. He grabbed the architect's hand and forced his own neural interface to sync. He flooded the architect's mind with the smell of Evelyn's burnt coffee, the sound of Leo's laughter, and the feeling of Mrs. Gable's morning greeting. He flooded the cold, logical machine with the messy, beautiful chaos of human love. The system couldn't handle the paradox. Across the globe, thousands of perfect people stopped in their tracks. In the Alps facility, the glass cylinders began to crack. The blue fluid leaked out. And the clones began to wake up, not as programmed units, but as confused, frightened individuals with flooded memories. Arthur Miller opened his eyes. He saw Silas and the architect struggling. For a split second, the vacant blue glow in Arthur's eyes vanished, replaced by the sharp, protective fire of a father. He didn't reach for a weapon. He reached for Evelyn's hand. "Run," Silas choked out, as the facility's self-destruct sequence initiated. The explosion was silent, swallowed by the vastness of the mountains. When the smoke cleared, the Aegis Group central hub was gone. There were no bodies found, only thousands of footprints leading away from the ruins into the wilderness. Weeks later, in a small, imperfect town in South America, a man, a woman, and 2 children sat at a dusty roadside cafe. They weren't perfect. Arthur had a scar on his hand, Evelyn's hair was messy, and the children were arguing over a comic book. They looked like any other family, lost in the crowd. A man in a worn trench coat watched them from a distance. He took a sip of bitter coffee and smiled. His eyes were no longer glowing. They were tired, bloodshot, and entirely human. The vanishing was over. They were finally found.